The first rumble started as nothing more than a distant tremor, but Clara Evans felt it in her bones before anyone else. Like most women in Wichita, Kansas in 1878, she shouldn't have been in the Silverstone mine at all, but necessity rarely concerned itself with proprieties. Clara pushed a strand of chestnut hair from her sweat-dampened forehead and continued examining the silver vein that ran along the tunnel wall. At 24, she'd learned more about mining than most men twice her age, though she kept that knowledge hidden beneath bonnet and skirt when in town. Her father's declining health had forced her hand. Someone needed to ensure their claim remained profitable, and Clara had always been a quick study. "Miss Evans, you really ought to head up now," called Thomas, an aging miner who'd worked for her father since before she was born. "Don't like the feel of things today." "Just a few more samples, Thomas," she replied, carefully chipping at the glistening wall. "Father needs to see these reports tonight if we're going to secure that bank loan." The second tremor came stronger than the first, sending loose rock skittering across the mine floor. Thomas grabbed her arm. "That ain't natural, miss. Please, we need to." His words vanished beneath a deafening crack as the world around them shuddered. Clara's lantern tipped and shattered against the ground, plunging them into darkness as the first support beams began to splinter. "Run!" Thomas shouted, pushing her forward. Clara stumbled ahead, her hands outstretched in the blackness. The roar grew louder, rock grinding against rock, timbers snapping like twigs. A massive impact knocked her to the ground, and something heavy struck her leg. She cried out in pain as the earth itself seemed to collapse around her. "Thomas!" She screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of destruction. When the rumbling finally subsided, Clara found herself in perfect darkness, pinned beneath debris, breathing air thick with dust. She called out repeatedly, but Thomas never answered. Hours passed in terrifying silence. Her trapped leg throbbed and thirst clawed at her throat. She drifted in and out of consciousness, wondering if this dark tomb would be her final resting place. Then, faintly at first, she heard it, the rhythmic sound of metal striking stone, growing gradually closer. Someone was digging. "Hello?" She cried hoarsely. "I'm here, please help me." The digging paused, then resumed with greater intensity. "Keep talking." A man's voice called back, muffled through layers of rock. "I'm coming for you." Miles away, just hours earlier, Preston Vance had ridden into Wichita with no intention of staying longer than a night. At 30, he'd spent most of his adult life moving from one cow town to another, taking ranch work when it was offered and moving on when the wanderlust struck him again. The war had left him with little taste for settling down, and the decades since had only strengthened his nomadic tendencies. He just collected his modest pay from a cattle drive-up from Texas when he overheard the commotion at the saloon. Mine collapse at Silverstone. A dust-covered man shouted as he burst through the doors. "Need every man who can swing a pickaxe." Most of the saloon patrons continued their drinking, offering sympathetic murmurs but little else. Mining accidents weren't uncommon, and most believed miners knew the risks they took. "How many trapped?" Preston asked, setting down his whiskey. "Don't rightly know. Maybe a dozen, maybe more," the man replied, eyes darting desperately around the room. "Old man Evans' daughter was down there too." Preston's brow furrowed. "A woman in the mine, Clara Evans. Smart as a whip, that one. Been helping her pa run the place since he took ill. They're offering good money for rescue workers." Preston wasn't motivated by the promise of payment. He'd seen too much death already in his life. But the thought of a woman trapped beneath the earth stirred something in him he couldn't ignore. 20 minutes later, he was riding hard toward the Silverstone mine, his few possessions still in his saddlebags. The scene at the mine entrance was chaos. Families wailed, miners argued about the best approach, and the company manager looked completely overwhelmed. Preston tied his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Chance, to a hitching post and approached the foreman. "Where do you need help?" he asked simply. The foreman, a barrel-chested man with a salt and pepper beard, looked him up and down. "You ever worked a mine collapse before, Cowboy?" Preston shook his head. "But I dug trenches during the war. I know how to move earth without bringing more down." The foreman nodded grimly. "We've got 3 rescue parties working different tunnels. Eastern shafts where we think most folks were working. That's where Evans' girl would likely be." "I'll take the eastern shaft then," Preston said, already removing his coat. "You'll need these," the foreman said, handing him a pickaxe, shovel, and lantern. "And son, be careful. Those tunnels were unstable before the collapse. One wrong move and you'll need rescuing yourself." Preston nodded and moved toward the tunnel entrance, where several miners were already clearing debris. He worked alongside them silently at first, his strong arms and back proving useful as they removed rubble bucket by bucket. Hours passed. Some men left, exhausted, only to be replaced by fresh workers. Preston continued, driven by a strange sense of purpose. When they reached a larger cave-in, the team split up to investigate different offshoots. Preston chose a narrow passage that the others avoided due to its tight confines. He worked alone, inching forward through increasingly confined space, having to lie on his back to chip away at the ceiling. His lantern cast eerie shadows as sweat soaked through his shirt, despite the cool underground air. That's when he first heard a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Someone was alive on the other side. "Hello," he called out. "Can anyone hear me?" Silence, then a faint cry. "Help, please, I'm trapped," a woman's voice. Preston's heart raced as he redoubled his efforts, calling out occasionally so she would know help was coming. "What's your name?" he shouted through the rock. "Clara Evans," came the weak reply. "Are you alone? Is anyone else coming?" "Name's Preston Vance," he called back. "There are others searching different tunnels. Just hold on, Miss Evans. I'll get to you." Through the night he worked, refusing offers of relief from other miners. The passage was too narrow for most men anyway, and Preston feared losing precious time with a switch. His hands blistered and bled, but still he continued, guided by Clara's voice growing gradually clearer. "Talk to me," he called to her as he worked. "Keep talking so I know you're still with me." "What? What should I say?" Her voice sounded weak, pained. "Anything. Tell me about yourself." "Why were you in the mine?" As Preston chipped and dug through stone, Clara told him about her father's silver claim, his illness, her secret studies of mineralogy and geology, anything to keep her mind off the crushing darkness and pain in her leg. "Not many women would take on mining operations," Preston commented, his pickaxe striking rhythmically. "Not many women have a choice," she replied. "Father has no sons and we'd lose everything if the mine failed." Preston worked through the night, refusing food but accepting water when it was passed to him. His muscles screamed with fatigue, but each time he considered resting, Clara's voice would come through the diminishing barrier, sometimes strong, sometimes barely a whisper, and he would continue. As the first hint of dawn filtered into the mine entrance far behind him, Preston's pickaxe finally broke through. A small opening appeared and dusty air rushed between the chambers. He quickly widened the hole until it was large enough to pass through. "I'm coming in," he called, grabbing his lantern and squeezing through the jagged opening. The beam of light revealed a scene of devastation. The tunnel had completely collapsed, creating a small pocket where Clara had been protected by a fallen support beam that had wedged against the wall. She lay half buried in debris, her face pale with dust and pain, but her eyes a striking blue-green locked onto his with fierce determination. "You came," she whispered, as if she hadn't truly believed it until this moment. "Told you I would." Preston carefully moved closer, assessing her situation. "Your leg's trapped. I need to move these rocks very carefully." "There was another man, Thomas," Clara said urgently. "He was with me when it happened." Preston's lantern revealed a grim sight just beyond where Clara lay. An outstretched hand protruded from beneath a massive section of fallen ceiling. He didn't need to check to know Thomas hadn't survived. "Let's focus on getting you out," Preston said gently, understanding in his eyes telling Clara all she needed to know about Thomas's fate. Working methodically, Preston cleared the debris from around Clara, talking softly to distract her from the pain and her companion's death. When he finally freed her leg, she cried out as circulation returned to the limb. "Can you move it?" he asked. Clara gritted her teeth and nodded. "It's not broken, I think, just badly bruised. Good, because we've got a bit of a crawl ahead of us." Preston looked back at the narrow opening he'd created. "Think you can make it?" After spending the night thinking I'd die here, Clara managed a weak smile. "I could crawl through the gates of hell if it meant seeing sunlight again." Preston chuckled despite himself. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." He helped Clara to a sitting position, supporting her as a wave of dizziness washed over her. She'd been without water for nearly 18 hours, and the strain showed in her cracked lips and unfocused gaze. "Here," he offered his canteen. "Small sips." Clara drank gratefully, then looked at him properly for the first time. Despite the dirt and sweat covering his face, she could see he was handsome, strong jaw covered in stubble, intense brown eyes that seemed to see right through her, and dark hair that curled slightly where it had escaped his hat. "Why did you come?" she asked quietly. "You're no miner." "I can tell by your hands." Preston looked down at his bloodied palms. "No, madam, just a cowboy passing through." "Then why risk your life for strangers?" Preston was silent a moment. "I've seen enough people die. Figured I could try saving someone for a change." Before Clara could respond, a distant shout echoed through the tunnel. More rescuers had arrived. "Let's get you out of here," Preston said, gently helping Clara to her feet. The journey back through the narrow passage was painful and slow. Preston went first, guiding Clara as she crawled despite her injured leg. When they finally emerged into the main tunnel, a cheer went up from the rescue team. "She's alive," someone shouted back toward the entrance. "They found Evans' girl." Strong hands reached for Clara, but she clung to Preston's arm. "Stay with me," she whispered, suddenly afraid of being separated from the man who had spent the night digging for her. Preston nodded, supporting her as they made their way toward the surface. When they finally emerged into the dawn light, Clara squinted against the brightness she'd feared she might never see again. A crowd had gathered: miners, townspeople, and her father, propped up between two men, his face lined with worry and relief. "Clara," he called, his voice breaking. As she was helped toward her father, Clara looked back at Preston, who stood uncertainly at the mine entrance, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkness behind him. "That's the man who saved me," she told her father when they embraced. "Preston Vance." Daniel Evans beckoned Preston forward with a trembling hand. "My daughter is all I have left in this world, Mr. Vance. I haven't the words to thank you." Preston removed his hat, suddenly self-conscious of his filthy appearance. "No need for thanks, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," Clara said softly. "You did." A doctor pushed through the crowd and insisted on examining Clara immediately. As she was helped to a wagon, she called back to Preston. "You'll come to the house later. Father will want to thank you properly." Preston hesitated, glancing at his horse still tied where he'd left it the previous evening. His instinct, as always, was to move on, but something in Clara's eyes made him nod. "Yes, madam. I'll be along shortly." The Evans residence stood on a small hill overlooking Wichita, a modest but well-maintained home that spoke of comfortable means without ostentation. Preston approached that afternoon, having bathed in the river and changed into the cleanest clothes from his saddlebags. He'd considered simply riding out of town. It wouldn't be the first time he'd left without goodbyes, but the memory of Clara's eyes kept him from mounting up. A housekeeper answered his knock and led him to a sunlit parlor where Clara reclined on a settee, her injured leg elevated on pillows. Her father sat nearby in a wheeled chair, his thin frame suggesting the illness Clara had mentioned. "Mr. Vance," Clara brightened when he entered. Freshly bathed and dressed in a simple blue dress, she looked transformed from the dust-covered woman he'd pulled from the mine. Her chestnut hair, now clean and brushed, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Miss Evans, Mr. Evans." Preston nodded to them both, hat in hand. "I trust you're feeling better." "Thanks to you," Clara smiled. "Dr. Simmons says I'm lucky no broken bones, just severe bruising and some cuts. I'll be on my feet again in a week or so." "Please sit." Daniel Evans gestured to a nearby chair. "Margaret will bring tea." Preston sat uncomfortably, unused to parlors and social niceties after years of bunkhouses and campfires. "I can't stay long," he said, though he had nowhere particular to be. "Long enough to discuss how we might repay you, I hope," Daniel said. "Clara tells me you worked through the night without rest. Most men would have given up." Preston shifted in his chair. "As I said, no need for repayment." "Nonsense," Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "I may be ill, Mr. Vance, but I'm still a businessman. Everyone has their price." "Father," Clara admonished gently, then turned to Preston. "What my father means to say is that we're incredibly grateful. The mine manager mentioned you're a cowhand passing through. Do you have employment lined up?" Preston shook his head. "Was heading north, thought I might find work on one of the big spreads in Montana." Daniel and Clara exchanged a glance. "Mr. Vance," Daniel leaned forward in his chair, "I find myself in need of a foreman for the Silverstone, someone who understands hard work and isn't afraid to make difficult decisions. After yesterday's collapse, half my men have quit, and I can't blame them." Preston blinked in surprise. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I don't know the first thing about mining." "You know about leadership, though," Clara interjected. "I saw how the rescue teams responded to your directions. The mining part can be learned. And the pay would be considerably better than cowboying," Daniel added. "Plus lodging on the property." Preston looked between them, momentarily speechless. He'd never stayed in one place longer than a season since the war ended. The thought both terrified and oddly appealed to him. I need to think on it," he finally said. Daniel nodded. "Of course. But don't take too long. We need to get that mine operational again soon, or we'll lose our contracts." After tea and polite conversation, Preston took his leave, promising to give them an answer within 2 days. As he reached the door, Clara called to the housekeeper to help her up. "I'll walk Mr. Vance out, Margaret." Despite the housekeeper's protests, Clara limped to the front door, leaning heavily on a cane. "You should be resting," Preston admonished gently when they reached the porch. "I've had quite enough of lying down," Clara replied with a small smile. Then more seriously, "I want you to know that the job offer is genuine. Father needs someone he can trust, especially now." Preston looked out over the town below. "Why me? You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Clara said softly. "I know you dug through solid rock for hours to save a stranger. I know you spoke kindly to keep me from giving up hope. Sometimes that tells you more about a person than years of acquaintance." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of two souls who had experienced more of life's hardships than most. "I'll think on it," Preston repeated, placing his hat back on his head. "Good day, Miss Evans." Clara watched him walk down the hill, his tall figure straight and unhurried despite his exhaustion. She didn't know what had driven him to save her life, but she found herself desperately hoping he would stay in Wichita long enough for her to find out. Preston spent that night camped by the river, staring into his small fire as he weighed his options. The smart move would be to continue north, as planned. Staying too long in one place inevitably led to complications. Yet every time he considered packing up, Clara's face appeared in his mind. Not just her beauty, though that was undeniable, but the strength he'd witnessed as she endured being trapped in total darkness with remarkable courage. The following morning, Preston rode to the Silverstone mine. The entrance had been secured with new timber supports, and a handful of miners worked to clear debris. He dismounted and approached the foreman he'd met during the rescue. "Thought you'd be halfway to Montana by now," the man said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Considering an offer from Evans," Preston replied. "What can you tell me about the operation here?" The foreman, who introduced himself as Joseph Miller, gave Preston a thorough tour of the mine and its workings. The collapse, he explained, had been caused by inadequate supports in a new tunnel, a corner-cutting measure ordered by the previous foreman who'd since fled town. "Evans runs a fair operation," Miller concluded as they emerged back into sunlight. "But since he took ill, things have gotten sloppy. Miss Clara tries, bless her, but the men don't take orders from a woman the same way." "And the mine itself, is it profitable?" Miller nodded. "One of the richest silver veins in Kansas. With proper management, it could be producing double what it is now." Preston thanked him for the information and rode into town. At the bank, he made discreet inquiries about the Evans family's financial standing. The banker was surprisingly forthcoming. Everyone in Wichita knew the Evanses were land-rich but cash-poor since Daniel's illness, and the collapse would only worsen their situation. By afternoon, Preston had made his decision. He returned to the Evans home and was again shown to the parlor, where Clara sat alone, reviewing ledgers despite her father's apparent instructions that she rest. "Mr. Vance," she brightened, closing the book. "I didn't expect you so soon." "I've considered your father's offer," Preston said without preamble. "And," Clara tried to keep her expression neutral, but hope flickered in her eyes, "I'll take the position with conditions." Clara raised an eyebrow. "What conditions?" "Full authority over the mine operations. No interference from your father or—" He hesitated. "Or you." Clara's mouth tightened slightly. "You should discuss this with father." "I'm discussing it with you because I suspect you're the one really running things," Preston said bluntly. "Miller told me how involved you've been." A flash of irritation crossed Clara's face. "And that bothers you? A woman with opinions about her family's business?" "Not at all," Preston replied evenly. "But if I'm to be responsible for men's lives, I need to know my decisions won't be undermined." They regarded each other for a long moment before Clara nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but I want to be kept informed. This mine is our livelihood." "Of course," Preston agreed. "Where is your father? I should speak with him directly." "The doctor is with him. His condition worsened this morning." Worry creased Clara's brow. "The stress of the collapse, I suppose." Preston's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. Shall I return tomorrow?" "No, please stay," Clara said quickly. "He'll want to see you when the doctor finishes. In the meantime, perhaps you could help me understand these production reports. If we're to work together, you should know our current situation." Preston hesitated, then took a seat beside her. For the next hour, Clara walked him through the mine's records, explaining the operation with a clarity and understanding that impressed him. Her intelligence was evident in how she analyzed problems and proposed solutions, all while downplaying her own considerable knowledge. "You'd make a fine mine manager yourself," Preston commented as she demonstrated how to calculate silver yields. Clara laughed softly. "In another world, perhaps, but here I must be content with working through others." She gave him a pointed look. "Like you." The housekeeper interrupted to announce that Daniel was awake and asking for Clara. She excused herself, leaving Preston alone with his thoughts. The parlor walls were adorned with framed botanical illustrations and landscape paintings. Clara's work, he guessed, noting a signature in the corner of one. A bookshelf held volumes on geology, mining techniques, and botany, alongside novels and poetry collections. This was a home of education and refinement, worlds away from the sparse bunkhouses and saloons that had been his usual haunts. Clara returned shortly. "Father will see you now. He's weak but lucid." She led Preston upstairs to a spacious bedroom where Daniel Evans reclined against pillows, looking frailer than he had the previous day. A silver-haired doctor was packing his bag beside the bed. "Ah, Mr. Vance," Daniel extended a thin hand. "Clara tells me you've accepted our offer." Preston shook his hand carefully. "Yes, sir, provided we agree on terms." Of course." Daniel gestured to a chair. "Doctor, you've met Mr. Vance, the man who saved my daughter." "Indeed," the doctor nodded. "The whole town's talking about your heroics, sir. Well deserved." After the doctor departed with a reminder to Daniel about rest, they discussed the particulars of Preston's employment salary, accommodations in the foreman's cabin near the mine, and most importantly, his authority over operations. "I'll want to hire back some men and bring in new blood," Preston explained. "Safety needs to be the priority, even if it slows production temporarily." Daniel nodded weakly. "I trust your judgment. Clara speaks highly of you and she's not easily impressed." Clara, standing by the window, gave her father a reproachful look that made Preston wonder what else they might have discussed in his absence. "One more thing," Daniel continued. "I'd like you to escort Clara to and from the mine when necessary, after what happened." His voice faltered. "Father, I'm perfectly capable," Clara began. "Please, Clara," Daniel's voice grew stronger with emotion. "I nearly lost you once. Grant me this peace of mind." Clara fell silent and Preston nodded. "Of course, sir. Miss Evans will be safe in my company." As they left Daniel to rest, Clara paused in the hallway, her expression troubled. "I hope you don't think my father is trying to make you my keeper." "Not at all," Preston assured her. "It's natural for him to worry after what happened." Clara studied him for a moment. "You're very understanding." Preston shrugged. "I lost family in the war. Makes you appreciate those you still have." Something in his tone made Clara want to ask more, but she sensed his reluctance to elaborate. Instead, she changed the subject. "The foreman's cabin will need some attention before you move in. No one's lived there since Mr. Blackwell left 3 months ago. I've slept in worse places." Preston smiled slightly. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow, if possible," Clara replied. "I'd come with you, but—" She gestured to her injured leg. "Rest," Preston said firmly. "I can handle things for now. We'll have plenty of time to work together once you've healed." As Preston prepared to leave, Clara walked him to the door despite her limp. "Mr. Vance," she said hesitantly, "I want to thank you again, not just for saving my life, but for staying. Father needs someone he can rely on right now." "And what about you, Miss Evans?" Preston asked quietly. "What do you need?" The question caught Clara off guard. No one had asked her that in years, her needs always subordinate to her father's illness and the mine's demands. She began, then smiled wryly. "I suppose I need someone who won't treat me like I'm made of china, despite recent events." Preston's eyes crinkled slightly. "I believe I can manage that. The following weeks established a new rhythm at the Silverstone mine. True to his word, Preston implemented stricter safety protocols, fired the men responsible for the substandard tunnel supports, and recruited experienced miners from neighboring towns. Production slowed initially, but as the workers gained confidence in the improved conditions, output gradually increased. Preston settled into the foreman's cabin, a simple two-room structure a quarter-mile from the mine entrance. Clara had sent workers ahead of his arrival, and he found the place cleaned, the roof repaired, and basic furnishings installed. It was the first place he could call his own since before the war, and though sparsely appointed, it quickly began to feel like home. Clara recovered steadily from her injuries, though nightmares of being buried alive plagued her sleep. True to her determined nature, she insisted on returning to the mine office 10 days after the collapse, despite her father's protestations. Preston found her there one morning, poring over maps and ledgers, her face pale but resolute. "Should you be up and about?" he asked from the doorway. Clara glanced up, a flash of defiance in her eyes that quickly softened. "Dr. Simmons says light activity is fine. Besides, I was going mad sitting at home all day." Preston didn't argue. Instead, he pulled up a chair and began updating her on the mine's progress. They fell into an easy working relationship, Preston handling the physical operations and the men, Clara managing the business aspects and record-keeping. "The new support system you designed is working well," Preston told her one afternoon as they reviewed the week's production figures. "Miller says it's the safest the main shaft has ever been. It's a modified version of what they are using in the silver mines in Nevada," Clara explained. "I read about it in a journal." Preston shook his head in admiration. "Most men in this business don't read half as much as you do." "Most men don't have to prove themselves constantly," Clara replied without rancor. Their conversations often took such turns, brief glimpses into deeper waters neither was quite ready to explore. Preston found himself increasingly drawn to Clara's intellect and quiet determination. For her part, Clara discovered in Preston a rare man who listened to her ideas without dismissal or condescension. Daniel Evans watched their growing rapport with interest. His health continued to decline despite the doctor's efforts, and he increasingly relied on Clara and Preston to manage both household and business affairs. One evening, as Preston delivered the weekly production reports, Daniel asked him to stay for dinner. "Clara tells me the men respect you," Daniel said as they waited for Clara to join them in the dining room. "That's no small achievement, considering how quickly you've had to learn the business." "Your daughter is an excellent teacher," Preston replied honestly. Daniel's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Yes, she is. Reminds me of her mother, brilliant, headstrong, and far too beautiful for her own good." He sighed. "Elizabeth would have been proud of the woman Clara's become." "I'm sure she would," Preston agreed, wondering where this conversation was heading. "Mr. Vance," Daniel leaned forward, his voice lowering confidentially, "I'm not one for beating around the bush. My health isn't improving despite what I tell Clara." Preston nodded solemnly. "I suspected as much. When I'm gone, Clara will inherit everything: the mine, this house, our other holdings." Daniel's gaze intensified. "There are men in town already circling like vultures, seeing her as a path to wealth rather than the remarkable woman she is." "Sir, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Daniel interrupted. "I merely want you to know that whatever your intentions toward my daughter, I've observed your character these past weeks. You're a good man, Preston Vance, despite whatever shadows you carry from your past." Before Preston could respond, Clara entered the dining room, her cheeks flushed from the kitchen's heat. "Margaret says dinner is ready," she announced, looking curiously between them. "Have I interrupted something?" "Not at all, my dear," Daniel smiled innocently. "Mr. Vance and I were just discussing the mine." Throughout dinner, Preston found himself unusually distracted. Daniel's words had forced him to confront feelings he'd been avoiding: his growing attachment to Clara, his reluctance to consider a future beyond Wichita, the memories that still haunted his nights. Clara noticed his quietness. "Is something wrong with the roast?" she asked as he pushed the meat around his plate. "No, it's excellent," Preston assured her. "Just thinking about the new tunnel we're starting tomorrow." Clara didn't appear convinced but didn't press him further. After dinner, as Daniel retired early, she invited Preston to the garden for fresh air. The evening was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky as they walked slowly along the garden path. Clara had discarded her cane a few days earlier, but still moved gingerly, occasionally steadying herself on Preston's arm. "You've been distant tonight," she said after they'd walked in silence for several minutes. "Is it something Father said?" Preston hesitated. "Your father is concerned about your future." "My future?" Clara stopped, turning to face him. "In what way?" "He's worried about men pursuing you for the wrong reasons," Preston said carefully. Clara's expression clouded. "Did he ask you to?" "What? Protect me from fortune hunters?" Her voice sharpened. "Or is he trying to matchmake again?" "Again?" Preston raised an eyebrow. Clara sighed, resuming their walk. "Before his illness, Father paraded every eligible bachelor in Kansas through our parlor. The mine owner's daughter was quite a catch." "And none of them caught your interest?" Preston asked, trying to keep his tone light. "They were interested in the mine, not me," Clara replied matter-of-factly. "Or they wanted a proper society wife who would abandon unfeminine pursuits like geology." They reached a small bench beneath an elm tree and Clara sat, inviting Preston to join her. The evening air carried the scent of late summer blooms, and fireflies had begun to flicker in the gathering darkness. "What about you, Mr. Vance?" Clara asked quietly. "You never speak of your past." "Was there someone before?" Preston looked out into the darkness. "There was a girl before the war. Mary was her name." He rarely spoke of her, but something about the night and Clara's presence loosened his tongue. "We were to be married when I returned. I was one of the lucky ones, came back with all my limbs, if not all my peace of mind." "What happened?" Clara asked gently. "She'd married someone else, a man who didn't go to war." Preston's voice held no bitterness, only an old faded sorrow. "Can't blame her. 3 years is a long time to wait on a promise that might never be kept." Clara was silent a moment. "Is that why you never settled anywhere?" Preston nodded slowly. "Partly. The war changed me. Couldn't see myself farming or keeping a store. Riding the open range seemed simpler, no attachments, no disappointments. Until you decided to dig through half a mountain for a stranger," Clara said softly. Their eyes met in the dim light. Preston felt a dangerous urge to reach for her hand, to close the carefully maintained distance between them. "I should go," he said abruptly, standing. "Early start tomorrow." Clara stood too, disappointment fleeting across her features. "Of course. Thank you for coming to dinner." As Preston rode back to his cabin, he berated himself for sharing so much. Getting involved with Clara Evans would only complicate matters. She was his employer's daughter, educated and refined, while he was just a drifter who'd stumbled into temporary stability. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, not just her beauty, but her resilience, her sharp mind, the way her eyes lit up when discussing a new idea. For the first time in years, Preston Vance found himself considering a future beyond the next season, and that thought terrified him more than any collapsing mine ever could. The following week brought new challenges. A dispute with the smelter in town threatened their processing arrangement, and Preston spent long days negotiating alternative options. Clara focused on securing additional investment to expand the more promising tunnels, often working late into the evening at the mine office. One such night, Preston returned from Wichita to find the office still lit. Inside, Clara had fallen asleep at her desk, head pillowed on her arms amidst scattered papers. The sight stirred something protective in him. He approached quietly, noticing the dark circles beneath her eyes and the tension in her shoulders even as she slept. "Clara," he said softly, touching her shoulder. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She startled awake, momentarily disoriented. "Preston, what time is it?" "Past 10, he replied. "You should be home." Clara rubbed her eyes. "I need to finish these projections for the bank meeting tomorrow." "They can wait until morning," Preston said firmly. "You're exhausted." Clara began to protest but stopped as Preston gathered her papers into a neat stack. "I can walk you home." "I have my horse," she sighed, standing stiffly. "Then I'll ride with you," Preston insisted. "It's not safe for you to be alone this late." Clara was too tired to argue. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, the moon casting silver light across the landscape. They rode in companionable silence until Clara spoke. "Father's worse," she said simply. "Doctor says it might be weeks, not months." Preston glanced at her, understanding now the exhaustion in her face. "I'm sorry, Clara," she nodded, keeping her eyes forward. "I've had time to prepare for this, but somehow it doesn't make it easier." "It never does," Preston replied softly. When they reached the Evans house, Preston helped Clara dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. In the moonlight, her face seemed both vulnerable and strong, a contradiction that defined her. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him, "for the escort and for understanding." "Get some rest," he said gently. "I'll handle things at the mine tomorrow." Clara surprised him by reaching up to touch his cheek briefly. "Good night, Preston." As he rode back to his cabin, Preston could still feel the warmth of her fingers against his skin. The walls he'd built around his heart since the war were crumbling, stone by stone, and he was powerless to stop it. October brought cooler weather and a turn in Daniel Evans' condition. One misty morning, Margaret arrived at the mine office with an urgent message. Clara needed Preston at the house immediately. He found her in the parlor with the doctor, her face pale but composed. "Father's asking for you," she said without preamble. Upstairs, Daniel lay propped against pillows, his breathing labored but his eyes clear. He gestured weakly for Preston to sit. "Not much time," Daniel said, each word an effort. "Need to speak plainly." Preston nodded, taking the frail hand that Daniel extended. "You've done well with the mine," Daniel continued. "Better than I hoped." "Thank you, sir," Preston said quietly. "Clara will inherit everything, mine, house, land." Daniel's grip tightened slightly. "She'll need help." "Not because she's incapable, God knows she's smarter than both of us, but because this world doesn't make it easy for women alone." Preston understood what Daniel was asking. "I'll stay as long as she needs me." Daniel's eyes searched Preston's face. "That's not all I'm asking, son." Preston held his gaze steadily. "I know, sir." "You love her?" Daniel asked directly. The question hung in the air between them. Preston could have evaded, could have claimed it was too soon, that their relationship was purely professional. Instead, he answered with the truth that had been growing in his heart for weeks. "Yes, sir, I do." Daniel smiled faintly. "Good. She deserves that." He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "She loves you too, though she's too stubborn to admit it yet." "Mr. Evans," Preston began, but Daniel cut him off. "No more time for formalities. I've watched you both. The way you look at each other when you think no one notices." His breathing grew more labored. Promise me you'll tell her. Life's too short for silence." "I promise," Preston said solemnly. Daniel nodded, satisfied. "Now send my daughter in. And Preston, thank you for saving her in more ways than one." Preston left the room, his mind reeling from the conversation. In the hallway, Clara waited anxiously. "He wants to see you," Preston told her, his voice rougher than he intended. Clara searched his face. "What did he say to you?" Preston shook his head slightly. "We can talk later. Go to your father." Daniel Evans died peacefully that evening with Clara holding his hand. The funeral, 2 days later, drew the entire town. Daniel had been respected as a fair employer and generous community member. Clara stood straight-backed beside the grave, accepting condolences with quiet dignity, while Preston remained a supportive presence at her side. In the days that followed, Clara threw herself into work with almost frantic energy, spending long hours at the mine and poring over ledgers late into the night. Preston worried but gave her space, understanding grief's different manifestations. A week after the funeral, Preston found Clara in the mine itself, inspecting a new silver vein by lantern light, deep in a tunnel he'd specifically ordered no one to enter alone. "What are you doing down here?" he demanded, his worry making his voice sharper than intended. Clara turned, startled. "Checking the new excavation. The samples look promising." "Alone? After what happened before?" Preston struggled to keep his frustration in check. "We agreed no one enters unstable tunnels without a partner." "I don't need supervision in my own mine," Clara replied, her chin lifting defiantly. "This isn't about ownership," Preston countered. "It's about safety. These rules apply to everyone, including you." They stared at each other, both stubborn, until Clara's shoulders suddenly sagged. "You're right. I apologize." The quick capitulation worried Preston more than her defiance had. "Clara, what's really going on?" She turned away, running her fingers along the rough tunnel wall. "If I stop moving, stop working, I'll have to feel everything, and I'm not ready for that." Preston moved closer, his anger dissolving. "You can't outrun grief. Believe me, I've tried." "I know he was dying," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was prepared, but now there's this hollow space that nothing seems to fill." Without thinking, Preston reached for her, turning her gently to face him. In the lantern's glow, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "The last thing he said to me," Clara continued, "was that I shouldn't be afraid to seek happiness. That he wanted me to build the life I wanted, not the one others expected." Preston remembered his promise to Daniel. "Your father was a wise man. But what if I don't know what I want anymore?" Clara asked, vulnerability replacing her usual confidence. Preston took a deep breath. "Clara," the sudden creak of timber overhead interrupted him. Without hesitation, Preston grabbed Clara and pulled her against the tunnel wall as a shower of small rocks and dirt fell where they had been standing. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, keeping his body between her and the unstable ceiling. "This section isn't properly supported yet." They moved quickly toward the tunnel entrance, Preston maintaining a protective arm around Clara's shoulders. Once they reached the safety of the main shaft, Clara turned to him, eyes wide with the memory of her previous entrapment. "Thank you," she said shakily. "Again." Preston's heart pounded from more than just the near miss. "Clara, we need to talk, but not here." They emerged from the mine into late afternoon sunlight. Without discussion, they walked to a small hilltop overlooking the operation, where a lone oak tree provided shade. The town of Wichita spread out in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys as evening approached. "Your father asked me to make him a promise before he died," Preston began once they were seated on the grass. Clara looked at him expectantly. "What kind of promise?" "He asked me to tell you the truth about how I feel." Preston met her gaze directly. He seemed to think you might share those feelings. Clara's breath caught. And how do you feel, Preston? The moment stretched between them, years of Preston's carefully maintained distance collapsing in an instant. I love you, Clara, he said simply. I think I started falling the moment I heard your voice through the rocks, before I'd even seen your face. I've spent years avoiding attachments, convinced I wasn't meant for anything permanent, but you've changed that. Clara's eyes widened at his directness. Preston, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I know you're grieving and the timing is terrible. I just promised your father I would be honest with you. Clara shook her head, a small smile forming despite the tears in her eyes. The timing is terrible, she agreed, but that doesn't change the truth. She reached for his hand. I love you too. I've been fighting it because it seemed impossible, the independent mine owner's daughter and the wandering cowboy. Preston's fingers tightened around hers. I'm not wandering anymore. Are you certain? Clara asked, vulnerability in her question. I couldn't bear it if you left once the novelty wore off. Clara, Preston said earnestly, I've spent 10 years running from the possibility of loss, but when that mine collapsed, and I thought about you trapped and afraid in the darkness, I realized that some things are worth the risk. He brought her hand to his lips. You're worth the risk. Clara's free hand moved to his cheek. So are you. As the setting sun cast long shadows across the hillside, Preston leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing certainty as Clara responded, her arms encircling his neck. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Father would be terribly pleased with himself right now, Clara murmured, smiling through tears. Preston chuckled. He wasn't subtle with his matchmaking. No, Clara agreed, but he was right. She grew serious. What happens now? The mine still needs running and there will be talk. Let people talk, Preston said firmly. We'll run the mine together properly, and as for us. He hesitated, then continued with newfound confidence. I'd like to court you, Clara Evans, properly with your permission. Clara's smile lit her entire face. Permission granted, Mr. Vance. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that blanketed Wichita in white silence. The Silverstone mine continued operations despite the weather, with Preston implementing heating systems in the main tunnels to prevent the workers from freezing during their shifts. Production increased steadily under their joint management, and by Christmas, the mine was more profitable than it had been in years. Preston and Clara's courtship proceeded under the curious, but largely approving eyes of the townspeople. They made no secret of their feelings. Though they maintained propriety, Preston still lived in the foreman's cabin, while Clara remained in her family home with Margaret as chaperone. Their evenings were often spent in Clara's parlor, discussing the day's operations before conversation turned to more personal matters. Preston gradually shared stories of his war experiences and the years of drifting afterward, while Clara spoke of her mother's early death and her struggle to be taken seriously in a man's world. Have you ever thought of studying formally? Preston asked one snowy evening as they sat before the fire. There are universities now that accept women for scientific studies. Clara looked surprised by the suggestion. I've read about them, but I never considered it possible. The mine always needed me here. The mine would survive a year or two without your daily presence, Preston pointed out. Especially now, Clara studied him curiously. Would you truly support such an endeavor? Why wouldn't I? Preston asked. Your intelligence is one of the things I love most about you. Clara's expression softened. Most men would prefer a wife focused solely on home and family. I'm not most men, Preston replied simply, and you're not most women, thank God. As February approached, bringing slightly milder weather, Preston began making secretive trips to town without explanation. Clara noticed but didn't question him, trusting his reasons were sound. On Valentine's Day, he invited her to dinner at the town's finest restaurant, an establishment that had only recently begun allowing women to dine without male relatives as escorts. Clara wore her best dress, a deep blue satin that complemented her eyes. Preston, usually comfortable in work clothes, had purchased a new suit for the occasion and looked uncharacteristically nervous as he escorted her to their table. "You're fidgeting," Clara observed as the waiter poured their wine. "Is something wrong?" Preston shook his head. "Nothing's wrong. Just thinking about how much has changed since I rode into Wichita," Clara smiled. "If someone had told me then that the cowboy digging me out of that mine would become the most important person in my life, I'd have thought them mad." "Life has a way of surprising us," Preston agreed. He reached across the table for her hand. "Clara, these past months have been the happiest of my life. After the war, I never thought I'd find peace again, let alone love, but you've given me both." Clara's eyes softened. "You've given me just as much, Preston. You treat me as an equal, respect my mind as well as my heart. I never thought I'd find a man who truly saw me." Preston took a deep breath. "I have something for you." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. Clara's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a delicate silver ring set with a deep blue sapphire, smaller diamonds glittering on either side. "It's not traditional," Preston explained, suddenly uncertain. "The jeweler suggested diamonds alone, but this reminded me of your eyes." "It's perfect," Clara whispered, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Preston stood and came around to her side of the table, kneeling beside her chair despite the curious glances from other diners. "Clara Evans," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "you are the bravest, most brilliant woman I've ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Clara answered without hesitation, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes, Preston Vance, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, applause broke out around the restaurant. Clara laughed in surprise, her cheeks flushing as Preston returned to his seat. "People will talk," she said, admiring the ring's sparkle in the candlelight. "Let them," Preston replied with a smile. It's about time Wichita had something good to gossip about. They married in April, when spring had softened the Kansas landscape with new growth and wildflowers. The ceremony took place in the town church, filled to capacity with miners, business associates, and curious townsfolk. Clara wore her mother's restored wedding dress, carrying a bouquet of prairie flowers. Preston, standing tall at the altar, felt a peace he'd never expected to find again. "You look beautiful," he whispered when she reached his side. "And you look terrified," she whispered back with a mischievous smile. "Only of disappointing you," he admitted. Clara's expression grew serious. "That could never happen." Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising partnership as well as love, unusual additions that raised eyebrows, but seemed perfectly fitting to those who knew them well. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Clara with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic miners. The reception was held at the Evans home, the garden adorned with lanterns and spring blooms. As evening fell, Preston found Clara standing alone near her father's favorite rose bushes. "Thinking of him?" Preston asked softly, placing an arm around her waist. Clara nodded. "He would have loved today, especially seeing how happy we are." "He knew before either of us," Preston acknowledged. "Wise man, your father." Clara turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "I want to show you something." She took his hand and led him to a small table set apart from the festivities. On it lay official-looking documents. "What's this?" Preston asked, picking up the top paper. "Deed to the Silverstone mine," Clara explained. As of today, it lists both our names as owners, equal partners, legally as well as practically. Preston stared at her in surprise. Clara, you didn't have to, I wanted to, she interrupted firmly. What's mine is yours now, and what better wedding gift than making official what's already true? Deeply moved, Preston pulled her into his arms. I don't deserve you. Probably not, Clara teased, her eyes dancing. But you're stuck with me now, Mr. Vance. Happily so, Mrs. Vance, he murmured before kissing her again. Later that night, after the guests had departed, Preston carried Clara across the threshold of the foreman's cabin, now expanded and renovated as their marital home. They had decided to live there rather than in the larger Evans house, both preferring the privacy and simplicity of the cabin and its proximity to the mine. Welcome home, Preston said as he set her on her feet in the cozy sitting room. Clara looked around at the space. They would share the bookshelves he'd built to hold her geological texts, the desk large enough for them both to work side by side, the comfortable chairs before the fireplace where they would spend evenings in conversation. It's perfect, she said, turning to face her husband. In the soft glow of the firelight, they began their life together, the cowboy who had once feared attachments and the woman who had defied conventions, united by a mind collapse that had buried old lives and uncovered new possibilities. As spring turned to summer, and summer to fall, Preston and Clara Vance became known throughout the region as innovative mine owners. Their emphasis on worker safety and fair wages drew skilled miners from across the country, while their implementation of new extraction techniques increased production beyond previous records. Clara did eventually pursue formal education, attending university in the East for advanced geology studies during the winters while Preston managed the mine. Their reunions each spring were joyful occasions that reaffirmed their commitment to supporting each other's dreams. In the autumn of 1880, their first child was born, a son they named Daniel, after Clara's father. The boy inherited his mother's curious mind and his father's steady nature, growing up with the mine as his playground and classroom. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth, who from an early age demonstrated her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength. The children grew up understanding that their family was perhaps unconventional, a mother who published papers in scientific journals, and a father who respected her achievements as much as his own. But they thrived in the atmosphere of mutual respect and profound love that defined the Vance household. Preston never did return to his wandering ways. The man who had once feared putting down roots found that love had given him something he never knew he needed: not just a home, but a purpose. On quiet evenings, he would often tell the children the story of how he had dug through half a mountain to find their mother trapped in darkness, and how, in saving her, he had ultimately saved himself. And Clara, who had once feared that her intelligence and independence would doom her to a life alone, discovered that the right partner didn't diminish her strength, but amplified it. Together, they built a legacy that extended beyond the silver. They pulled from the earth a testament to what could happen when two people found each other against all odds and refused to let go. On the 10th anniversary of the mine collapse that brought them together, Preston and Clara stood on the same hillside where they had first confessed their love. The Silverstone mine spread out below them, expanded and thriving under their joint stewardship. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been passing through Wichita that day?" Clara asked, leaning against his shoulder as the setting sun painted the landscape in gold. Preston considered the question, his arm tightening around her waist. "I think some things are meant to be, no matter what path we take to get there." Clara smiled up at him. "That sounds suspiciously like fate, Mr. Vance. Not very scientific." "Some things defy scientific explanation, Mrs. Vance," he replied, brushing a kiss against her temple. "Like how I heard your voice through solid rock when others couldn't, or how a woman trapped in darkness gave a lost man light." "Now you're being poetic," Clara laughed softly. "Maybe," Preston conceded with a smile, "but it's true nonetheless." As darkness fell across the Kansas prairie, they made their way home, hand in hand, the cowboy who had dug until dawn and the woman who had waited in darkness, bound together by silver, stone, and a love as enduring as the earth itself.